Welcome back to Growing Green Thumbs with Portland Nursery, where a novice and experienced grower come together to talk about all things plants. You're listening to our second episode from the ground up, but before we get into that, Katie has a few things to note about where we're broadcasting from and why it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, thanks, John. So again, we're broadcasting from Portland, Oregon, and we are Zone 8. Inner Portland is Zone 8B, but we're 8A, cold depths of the winter, 7B, definitely not Zone 9. So it gets a little complicated, but yeah, you can grow a lot of fun things here.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. So I can't believe we're already on episode 2. It feels like just last week we were doing episode 1. I think technically it was last week. That
Maybe,
makes sense.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the topic at hand, from the ground up, it's going to be kind of a gardening 101, the root of it all. We probably technically should have done this for the first episode, but that's okay.
It's more fun if we go backwards and forwards, just really like keep everyone on their toes.
Yeah, each and every moment for sure. So where do you think it's kind of a good idea to kind of start this conversation off today for a gardening 101 type of conversation?
Yeah, so, for a new gardener, I just want to make sure that they have the tools that they need. I've worked with some folks and it's just like, oh, we're just starting from scratch. Like, you need to get your hands dirty and get in there and start digging around. Yeah,
so you're ready to go outside. You suddenly realize you don't have a shovel.
Right.
It's kind of a bummer.
Right. It is kind of a bummer. Hopefully you have a nice neighbor.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think of some general tools that a new gardener should have?
Yeah, I really like shovels and a good sturdy shovel with a wide blade. There's some smaller models out there, but for kind of like a new gardener starting a new plot, I would recommend going for a sturdy shovel. It's just easier, I think, to kind of get more soil dug up that way. Especially for me, I'm a smaller person, and a larger shovel is great. You should have gloves to protect your hands. Folks like seed rippers to kind of pull plants out of the ground. Pruners.
That's one of my favorite tools.
Oh, the seed ripper. Oh, yeah.
I love the seed ripper.
Yeah, you were using that probably in the last episode.
Yeah. Actually, I've kind of got back to that a little bit, and my seed ripper has been getting quite a bit of use over the last week or so.
Good job.
Stellar tool.
Good job. I'm proud of you.
So seed rippers, pruners, I would imagine.
Yeah, pruners. I don't. I like Felcos a lot, but I don't own some because I'm really terrified of losing them. So I kind of have a more inexpensive pair, but you kind of get what you pay for with pruners. The quality is worth it.
Do you sharpen your pruners at all?
I should. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
You should. Yeah.
Always best to have sharp tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Recently, I did a post on social media, and I was asking people what some of their favorite gardening tools were, and the Hori Hori knife came up.
That is my absolute favorite. If I had to pick one, is definitely Hori Hori. I use that tool all the time. For those that don't know it, it's kind of a cross between a trowel and it's basically a planting knife, but it doesn't have a sharp blade. So it can really get in there. I basically use it like a seed ripper, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I've seen people do that.
To get into hard ground and just pull weeds, plant things. Yeah, it's something that I always have on me.
And I know it can be expensive sometimes, and that might kind of put some people off when they're thinking about all the tools they have to go get to start gardening. But people have to remember, too, that they can not necessarily have to buy new tools. They can always use secondhand tools.
Yeah, we're fortunate in Portland. There's different places that you can go and borrow tools, like tool libraries.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Ask your friends. Just make sure you bring it back and maybe bring them some beer or cupcakes or something.
Beer or cupcakes.
or cupcakes.
The two greatest gifts ever. So you had mentioned gloves before. I like protecting my hands, especially when I'm out in the garden. I found sometimes I lose a little bit of dexterity, so I like kind of tighter fitting gloves,
Oh, okay.
And I don't mind getting my hands dirty now, but when I was a kid, I hated being dirty.
Oh no.
Yeah, I was one of those kids that would wear socks in my sandals to the beach.
Oh, John.
All day long. Tube socks. So it had the extra leg protection as well.
That's very whatever decade that is.
That was the 80s. For sure. So, all right, I've got some of these tools.
Now you visualize John as a child in the 80s.
With my tube socks.
Good.
So real quick, I have about 30 tools laid out on the table here in front of me. What is this one right here?
Piece of paper.
That is, I don't have any tools. I'm just trying to keep you on your toes. Okay, so once we go out and we get all the tools that we need, like some pruners, a shovel, some gloves, a trowel, and you kind of just jam them all in the credenza or some other more suitable space for tools, and you're ready to go out and buy some plants. So I remember
I'm going to stop you there for a second, John.
Yeah.
I don't know what a credenza is.
I knew you were going to ask that, so I actually Wikipedia'd it. Just before I got there. It's a dining room sideboard, particularly one where a central cupboard is flanked by glass display cabinets.
I still can't picture that, but I'm going to believe you. Do you have a credenza?
I don't.
Okay.
But if I did, I might have some tools there.
Okay, sounds good.
So I remember the first time that I went to a nursery, and I'm like ready to rock. I pick out my first kind of plant in a nursery pot. I look at the nursery pot label, and suddenly I just realize, like, I don't necessarily know how the sun works or what this all means. I know how the sun works, but I don't know what all these descriptions about how much sun a plant needs means. What are all these light requirements? I see full sun. I see part sun. Some of them seem to kind of like overlap with each other. Once you have your tools, you go and you buy your plant. You see the sun requirements. What does that really mean in the real world?
Yeah. Well, for starters, the sun is a glowing ball of gas, John.
Thank you.
So that's what the sun is.
That clears that up. Okay.
Yeah. So the light categories. There's kind of three that I usually stick to. The full sun, part sun, and shade. So full sun is generally, you think about the growing season in Portland, and the growing season is spring and summer. So full sun is the hottest part of the day. So either if you don't have sun in the morning and the afternoon, that is full sun, or if you have all blazing hot afternoon sun, generally that is also considered to be full sun.
Okay.
And then part sun, you might hear part sun, part shade. The way that works is it's usually morning sun, and then afternoon shade, or it can kind of spill over into midday. But the main thing is that it's not getting blazing hot afternoon heat.
Got it. So I think you mentioned to me once that there's kind of a difference in sun requirements during the winter or the summer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, the plants aren't growing necessarily in the winter. So in the summer, they're going to need those optimum conditions. So like I said, if you're out in your yard, that's where you're going to want to focus on, is like where the light is in the summer. So if you have a tree, think about where it's in the summer, or like the angle of the sun in the spring and summer during the growing season, basically.
So if you're planning on starting a garden, but you're not really going to be ready to start buying stuff into the fall, it might be good to kind of start a gardening journal or like a sun journal to kind of map it out and kind of keep that set away somewhere.
Yeah. Or try to like extrapolate. Like you might still want to get stuff in the ground, so try to like extrapolate and sort of imagine.
Or a time machine.
Or you could go buy yourself a time machine and go back.
Yeah, check it out that way.
Yeah, just go back through seller photos from your realtor or something like that.
Absolutely.
That sounds terrible. Don't do that. And then where the shade. Sometimes shade can be a really easy thing to determine because you're like, well, this is under a bunch of trees. It is very shady here. Other times it can be really tricky because you think it's not shade, and then suddenly, poof, the tree gets leaves.
How would you describe the conditions under a tree like that? There's just like a little bit of sun coming through.
Yeah, generally one term that I hear a lot and I use a lot is dappled light. So it's where the sun's kind of being, or filtered light is another term. So where the sun's basically being filtered through the tree, and it might kind of move around a little bit, but basically the plants aren't getting a full blasting dose of sun.
Just a dapple.
A
dapple will do.
A little dapple of sun.
Okay.
And usually that can be part sun, but sometimes, depending if it moves enough, that can be more of a hot full sun spot. So sometimes, it's a more complicated question depending on your situation, and you might need to go with a more full sun plant or a part sun plant that can tolerate a little bit more full sun. It gets fun to just break it down.
And in terms of like the direction that the garden is kind of facing, like north, south, east, west, that's kind of an important consideration too, right?
Yeah, you're going to want to go back to your Boy Scout days, assuming you were maybe a Boy Scout or something.
I was a Cub Scout.
Okay, well, if you have a compass from your Cub Scout, stand out there with it and you learn your cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. And that's one way you can sort of go off of like where the sun might be. Generally, the hotter parts of the house are the south and west facing parts, and then north and east can be more shaded, but that kind of depends on your situation. You might have a tree in the west side of your house or something.
So if you were to go into a nursery and let's say you had a picture on your phone, kind of showing what the like conditions look like in a particular area, it's probably important then for them to make sure they do it at the right time of the year, and it's not a photo from like a time of year when it's not going to be as relevant.
Right. Yeah, you certainly, that would be very helpful. But I decipher through that sort of thing all the time where people are like, oh, I went outside in the winter because I just bought this house and like
Take some
this
photos.
is the photo that I have. And then you sort of to like muddle through it. But plants can be dug up and moved if it's in the wrong spot. Or
That's a great point.
One thing is you can also do a little sleuthing. You can kind of go off the other plants that are in the area and kind of, oh, there's hostas here. Well, I know that's a shade or part shade plant, so maybe this is a part shade or shade area.
So back to the sun thing. If you're growing a garden on the sun, there's probably no such thing as partial shade that you would have to worry about, right?
I know you're trying to ask me a trick question, but sometimes there might be, you know, a different shadow of the corner of your house in that spot. So it might
on
be
the sun.
On the sun?
Yeah, if you were growing a garden on the sun.
Oh, on the sun.
Yeah,
on
totally.
The sun. Yeah, it would die.
Okay.
Yeah, as we've learned in our Pacific Northwest heat wave where we were gardening on the sun.
That was intense. Okay, so we were making the trip back to the earth from the sun. I stop at the nursery on the way home. I grab a plant, get back to the house. I'm ready to put it in the ground. What's your advice on how to best proceed from there?
Yeah, well, so the roots go down. That's step
Thanks.
one.
Awesome. I'm going to write that one down.
Yeah.
Roots down, right?
Roots down, leafy parts up.
Leafy part up. Okay, I got that.
Okay, I'm going to just assume that our listening audience knows that step. And yeah, so planting basics. The size of the hole is important. You definitely don't want to overdo the depth of the hole. You want to visualize the pot or the plant that you're getting,
Okay.
and visualize that root ball, and you want to make the size of the hole about as deep as that. Say you pre-made your holes and you're like, oh no, these holes are now like 3 times the size of this and I can fit a car in this hole now. Like, okay, you can fill that in. That's totally fine. Like backfill a little bit so
Okay.
it's even with the depth. And then usually the general principle is to make the hole at least twice as wide as the root ball of the plant. And that's basically so you're decompacting the soil around. And
You can just set the pot in the hole too to kind of get an idea of if you're
sure.
getting close or not.
And it's an inexact science. Like, you don't have to be out there with like your measuring tape and like, well, it's 8 inches. And,
Okay.
you know, like just kind of make
Roll
it up
with
as
it.
you go, roughly twice as wide. Some circumstances, if you're growing next to another plant, you might not be able to do something like that. But if it's a brand new planting area, that'll help decompact the area, like if it had been walked on a bunch.
Okay. So once you kind of get the hole sized up right, and you're ready to plant it in the ground, are there any considerations for that step?
Well, like I said, you're going to want to put the roots in, and you don't want to leave your plant's roots out in the open air for very long. So don't just like pull it out and then like walk away and go take a shower and then come back. I don't know why you're taking a shower before you're gardening.
Yeah.
That seems kind of
My mid-gardening shower.
right.
Couldn't do without it.
Yeah. So don't do that. Roots don't like the open air. Roots so say you pull your plant out to like look at it, or it falls over, something like that. Always stick the roots like under something. You can use like damp burlap, or sometimes if it's a really small plant, paper towels. But basically the roots should always be covered in
I was going to ask about newspaper again.
oh yeah, you
From
could
last week.
potentially cover them in
you
newspaper, wet newspaper. if
Not
you need to.
magazines, though. I've learned that magazines have no place in the garden.
Maybe not.
Okay.
The one thing you take away is that magazines have no place in the garden.
Yeah, if you remember one thing from today and last week, no magazines. So
One,
you're gonna cover the roots to make sure, or the roots to make sure they
limited
don't dry.
time in the air. Yeah, they'll
Got it.
dry out. It's not good for them.
Should you loosen the roots?
Yeah, if they're really wound around, I'm making like a sort of squeezing motion with my hand that y'all can't see. Yeah, so kind of like you're gently massaging the roots. Sometimes if it's really if they're really wound around, you can get in there with your hori or a trowel or something and kind of like pull them apart and basically rip at them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you rip some apart, that's better than them just going in the hole and winding back around. I see a lot of folks bring back plants and the roots are still the same shape that they were in the pot.
Kind of like going around the perimeter.
Around and around, and the poor things
soil.
don't have a chance to escape, and it makes me so sad.
Okay, so loosen them up a little bit, or maybe a little bit more than a little bit.
A little bit more force with some of them. Yeah, it depends on the circumstance, and I'm sure there's a ton of YouTube videos. We should make a YouTube video about that, John.
We can do that. One thing at a time.
Right.
Come on.
Podcast. Focus on the podcast. So yeah, you also want to bury it. You don't want to bury it too deep with most of the plants. You want to bury it up to the crown of the plant. And basically, the crown of the plant is the interface, because I know you're going to ask me what the crown of the plant is. That is the interface between where the sort of stem of the plant and the roots meet is the crown. So generally, the level it's planted at in the nursery pot that you're buying it in is the level you want to use to plant it in the ground. Don't bury the crown. There's some things where maybe that's a thing you need to do, but most plants you don't bury the crown.
That makes sense
rot.
to me. Yeah.
More chance of rotting and disease and things.
That makes sense to me. In terms of adding things to the soil when you're planting, compost?
Right. It depends on what you're planting. Of course, if it's a vegetable bed, you want to make sure it's amended with lots of rich compost. And we'll probably talk about veggie bed stuff in a future podcast, so I won't go into it too much. Spoiler alert, we're going to talk about veggies at some point.
Veggies at some point. Write that down.
Okay. If you're planting trees, there's some things to consider, but yeah, you want to make sure you use some compost or maybe a little starter fertilizer, like a light starter fertilizer. And you would follow the directions on the box. Basically, that's my main thing is fertilizers. Follow the directions on the box.
I think that's excellent advice with pretty much anything.
Yeah, just follow the
directions on the box.
Google it.
Google it.
Yeah, so you can use compost generally with a lot of things. If you're say you're planting like a dahlia or a flower or something like that, a third planting compost to 2/3 of the natural soil. And again, it's an inexact science. So just like, a couple of handfuls is what I do when I'm sort of mixing into a new area. Some folks also spread compost and mix it in beforehand if it's a new planting area. Mm-hmm. And then you don't really have to worry about that so much. Maybe a little starter fertilizer.
I do that with our veggie beds whenever we start a new one.
Yeah.
Just kind of pre-mix it.
Yeah, that's typically done more with veggie beds or if folks are doing like a brand new from scratch garden. But oftentimes you're like adding into an established garden and then, yeah, you can just sort of mix away.
So in your experience, what do you think people are most worried about when they're planting for the first time?
I would have to say often it's trees because it's such a large investment and it can be hard to sort of visualize how big they're going to get to be, and folks are spending often a lot of money on them, and it's going to be a longevity sort of thing. So yeah, trees can be really, really stressful for people. And can I talk about trees for a little bit, John?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool.
I like absolutely agree too. We planted a Cornus moss maybe a year and a half ago, and I think it was one of the first trees I've planted as an adult. I remember doing it as a kid, but I was kind of intimidated by it at first. It's just like, this is, like you said, an investment. Mm-hmm. And there's, when you lose a tree, when you lose a tree as opposed to like losing a 4-inch veggie start, you kind of feel it a little bit.
Yeah, in your wallet and just kind of in your psyche a little bit. Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, one of the things to consider with trees is the best time of year to plant them. Sometimes you might have to plant them in not the ideal times of year. So not in the summer at all. Summer is a terrible time to plant them, but because it's so hot and those roots are baking, it's such a large organism that might be struggling and more transplant shock.
I was going to actually make a joke about knowing that you should never plant a tree in the summer because the Beach Boys never wrote a song about a tree before. But then I looked it up and they actually did write a song about planting a tree called A Day in the Life of a Tree. So I'm not doing that joke.
That joke doesn't work at all.
Doesn't work at all. I haven't listened to the song yet. I probably should. But that was Brian Wilson's response to his sense of increasing pollution around the planet.
Okay.
So the joke won't work.
Okay, well, I don't think I could relate because I don't think I know a single Beach Boys song, unfortunately.
When I want harmony, I go Bee Gees. I can say that. I'm not a huge Beach Boys fan.
I don't think we can talk music on this podcast because I have no idea what you're talking about.
We'll get back to the plants.
Anyways,
then.
Back to the point, trees. So the universities are steering us away from using a lot of planting compost when planting trees. Basically, we want the trees to develop to grow big and strong, and we want their roots to go outward into the harder clay. So making sure that they're not just like comfy and hanging out in that like comfy compost zone. And people tend to overdo it with compost as well, and that can also make it sink over time. So in most circumstances, the university is steering away from that with trees and just making sure you're staking it. You can mulch over top a few inches is good. That'll slowly break down. You can certainly use a starter fertilizer. But yeah, staking, mulching, and then good deep waterings.
Got it. And of course, too, you got to check before you dig too, right?
In lots of places,
yeah. Just make sure you know what you're doing. And there's some local numbers you can call too always. I don't have that in front of me. Is it 311?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Don't quote me on that. I should have looked.
I'm a renter, so I just go for it.
Just go for it.
Just kidding. I don't plant trees, actually.
See what happens.
But yeah, I guess, is this a good transition into watering before we wrap up this episode?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So, you get the plant, you plant it where it's going to get the right amount of light, but then there's that all-important next step and recurring step, which is going to be watering.
Right. So, like I said, you want to do deep watering with your plants, and that's so the roots go down and deeply so they can support themselves, especially like this, the heat wave we had. You want the plants to be able to go to deep water, especially like a tree. A lot of them should be able to survive on their own over time. So
when you say deep watering, can you explain that a little bit more?
Oh, yeah, sure. So the way I like to explain it to people is visualize the pot that you have and or the pot that the tree came in or how big your root system is. And then visualize with your hose how long it would take to fill up a bucket that size. As kind of like a visual amount of water to give, and then extra because you want the roots to go out beyond that. And that's sort of my image for folks of like how much water to give. So like the amount of the roots visualized in a bucket and then extra.
And there's, of course, like many different ways to go about watering too, right? You can water by hand, you use a sprinkler. What are some other options?
People use soaker hoses. People use drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is awesome because it the water doesn't evaporate as quickly with drip irrigation, and it kind of slowly waters it. So that's something a lot of folks use. Please don't ask me how to set up drip irrigation because that is Achilles heel.
We started using that several years ago for our veggie beds, and I think it's spectacular. Because you can set it up with a timer, and it's you can get really exact with how much water the plants are getting. My wife, though, was not a huge fan because it kind of took her away from spending as much time with the plants as she would spend when she was hand watering.
Oh, okay.
So there was that kind of like connection to the plants too that she felt removed from with drip irrigation as opposed to hand watering.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot of ways you can sort of like have some things on drip and some things to water by hand. But if you go out of town for the weekend or go on vacation or something like that, it's really nice to have those irrigation systems set up in place.
Real quick, it's 811.
Oh, okay.
before you dig. I don't know what I don't know if you should call 311. I don't know what that's going to be. But 811 is definitely what you want to call before you dig. Sorry
I just John was furiously Googling while we were talking about good job multitasking.
Here. Thank you. I appreciate it.
But some things to think about is if you're a renter, you probably don't want to go to the expense of setting up a custom irrigation system.
That's true. It can cost a little bit.
Yeah. So you can use things like sprinklers and stuff are a little bit easier, a little cheaper, more portable if you move.
And it kind of depends on what you're watering too. If you're doing a lawn versus something that needs some really exact.
Right. And then always checking to make sure that it's getting the water that it needs and it's actually going into the ground.
What's your favorite method to water?
I don't water my plants, John.
That's not true.
I'm just kidding. I am a renter, so I do
Look who's making jokes now. Okay. I see where this is going. All right.
No, but, I would set up drip irrigation if I was able to.
If it could be a little more permanent setting.
Yeah, but I water by hand right now.
Right on. So, is there anything else you kind of want to talk about today before we close out? Anything that comes to mind?
No, I think that's kind of everything.
We got the tools. Got the sun.
We know about the sun.
I know what the sun is now. Thank you for explaining that to me. I really appreciate that.
You worked in your Beach Boys joke.
Almost Beach Boys joke, but the Beach Boys ruined my Beach Boys joke. I'm still upset about that. So yeah, I think that if that's it, many thanks to TalkCast PDX for producing Growing Green Thumbs with Portland Nursery. And thank you all for listening as well. We'll be back next week to talk about the basics of pest management. We call it Stop Pestering Me. And that should be pretty exciting, right? Talk about some bugs.
Yeah, who doesn't like talking about slugs?
I love talking about slugs. And remember, please, while Katie is here answering all of my plant questions, Portland Nursery is always available to answer all of your plant questions. Visit us today here in Portland, Oregon at 50th and Stark, 90th and Division, or check out portlandnursery.com, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Katie.